the Economic Society. And we thank you all very much for coming along today. We have two guest speakers. We've got Monica, who's a PhD candidate at University of Queensland, and we've got David, who's a professor of behavioural economics at Griffith University. Thank you both for joining us today. First, I'd like to start off with a just simple rundown of what we're doing today. I'm going to give you a brief introduction to the Economic Society, and then we're going to listen to Monica's discussion about her PhD topic that she's been working on. And then we're going to transition into David, who's going to be discussing some of his research, which you all saw in the flyers. And then finally, we'll have a Q&A. Feel free to put your questions into the chat. And then that should round us off. We're hoping for around about half an hour, maybe a bit more today. So we'll see where it goes. All right, at the Young Economists, who we are, we're focused on creating events to bring economists together. We love creating events like this, where we can discuss the issues and learn from professionals in the field. We've got two events coming up. We got one called Policy in the Pub. We're hoping around September time to sort of get a sort of a pub sort of booked out. We're going to have someone, a guest speaker, discussing hopefully the effects of sanctions on the global economy, something very topical right now. And it's just a good place to have a few good beers, have a good chat, and sort of network with the wider economics community. And then after that, close to the end of the year, we're hoping to have a trivia night, where we're going to do some economics trivia at a pub or a bar. So keep a lookout for those details. If you're not already an ESA member, would highly recommend becoming one. You get early access to these events, you get some additional perks at the actual event, and it always looks great in your resume. And it's less than $3.99 per month. I mean, what a good deal that is. Anyway, so we might start with Monica. Are you able to sort of walk us through some of your PhD so far and maybe a bit of an introduction?
Yeah, should I start sharing my screen now, or yeah, there we go. Yes, absolutely. So get these slides up. So it's a very blunt title for this. It kind of hits all the points that I'm going to be talking about. So we have behavioral economics, policymaking, and a little bit of climate change too. So a bit about myself. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about my PhD research today, but also a lot about some of the key behavioral economics topics that I worked with in my prior job, which was more directly focused on behavioral economics. So currently, I'm a PhD candidate in political economy at the University of Queensland. My PhD is about examining how central banks, specifically comparing the West and East Asian countries, are addressing climate change. It doesn't particularly have a lot to do with behavioral economics specifically, although that has kind of remained with me as a lens with which to view the world. But I'll talk a little bit more about my PhD research at the end, just briefly. But before I started my PhD, I was a senior analyst at the New York Fed on a unit called Applied Critical Thinking, which specifically was a team that sought to apply insights from not just behavioral economics, but other kind of relevant fields as well to improve policymaking. And originally I got my bachelor's in environmental studies actually, and dabbled in some local government work in the middle. So I'll briefly summarize the team and kind of what the team did, and then I'm going to talk about some of the concepts in behavioral economics, both that I worked with while on this team, but also things that I find particularly interesting and I think relevant to anybody working in business or policy, and the application of those concepts. So the Applied Critical Thinking team was formed in the wake of the 2008 crisis. Kind of with the idea of, well, clearly something was missed. And so how can we do better in the future? How can we actually make policymaking better? And so the key insight from behavioral economics in the very broad sense is basically that economic actors aren't omniscient rational agents, and we can apply that to the way that we understand the economy, but we can also apply that to the way policymakers look at that economy and understand how to intervene in it. And so the question is, how can we leverage insights about judgment and decision-making from other fields applied to a central banking context to improve the way policymakers understand and respond to their environment? So this involves behavioral economics, cognitive science, but there's also a bit that I will bring in today around systems theory as well that I think is interesting and relevant. And you have the little disclaimer that all of the views here today are my own and are not official, both past and present views of the institution. So I'm gonna go over, hopefully this stuff won't be too basic, maybe for some of you it will if you're very familiar with behavioral economics, just the stuff I'll cover at the start. But one of the key authors that we read was Daniel Kahneman, who you may be familiar with. And so there's this great book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which is pretty accessible to any audience. It's not a super dense, well, it is pretty dense, but it's not an academic book necessarily. And so the key idea here is that we have, the question is, when are we relying on cognitive ease versus thinking critically when we're interpreting a policy environment, or, this goes beyond the policy realm as well. And so Kahneman distinguishes between two types of thinking: fast thinking, meaning associatively processing information, maintaining your model of the world. It's very efficient. The kind of tale goes, when our ancestors heard a rustling in the bush, they weren't going to sit there and think about all the different possibilities of what the rustling could be. They were going to think lion and they were going to run. And then to contrast that, you have slow thinking, or what Kahneman calls system 2 thinking, which is triggered by cognitive strain, more deliberative processing, and updating your model of the world. But as I said, not efficient to use this model all the time, or mode of thinking, all the time. A lot of you have probably seen this example by now, but if you see these three, let's say, numbers written, you see 12, 13, 14. But if you see the same 13 character written between A and C, it looks like a B. And so this just illustrates fast thinking, right? Because when you see the 12, 13, 14, you're not going to sit there and think, what could that 12 be? What could that 13 be? Or what could that 14 be other than 12, 13, 14? So that's just kind of a good illustration. As a result of the use of the system 1 and the shortcuts that come along with it, we see a variety of cognitive biases in the way that we think. You've probably heard of many of these: confirmation bias, favoring information that supports our beliefs; hindsight bias, or saying I knew it all along after something happens; base rate neglect, which is a particularly, I think, interesting one, meaning if you're looking at a situation, you overweight the specific circumstances in your mind and underweight how often certain types of things happen in general. So it's kind of the like, but this time is different. An anchoring effect, which is over-reliance on the first piece of data that you receive. Another key kind of thing that goes along with these insights is the idea that we all have mental models. And so I have this quote here: mental models are how we understand the world. Not only do they shape what we think and how we understand, but they shape the connections and opportunities that we see. Mental models are how we simplify complexity, why we consider some things more relevant than others, and how we reason. And I think mental models are a key concept in thinking about how do we apply some of the insights from behavioral economics to a policymaking context, for example, because a lot of what I've been talking about up until now with system 1, for example, and system 2 is we do a lot of system 1 thinking by necessity, and that system 1 thinking relies on our existing mental models. But a lot of the work around critical thinking is trying to externalize those mental models, trying to question them, which is easier said than done. But one of the more interesting methods, I think, and there are many methods, many different ways people have kind of tried to combat some of these challenging, they're not necessarily challenging circumstances to policymaking in particular. I mean, these are just the things that make us human. But when you're, working in some sort of high stakes job, you want to see what you can do to improve your thinking and your judgment and decision making. So there's this book called Super Forecasting, which is a very readable, great version of some important research that's been done by Philip Tetlock. So the background around forecasting is that this book kind of started from a forecasting tournament sponsored by a defense agency in the US in the wake of intelligence errors in Iraq. And the analogous question in economics context is, why did we fail to see X event, for example? There are a lot of different questions. But that's kind of the application here. And so the whole point of this forecasting tournament, which basically consisted, I have an example on one of the following slides, but basically consisted of setting up a very kind of like stylized judgment and decision-making environment where there were these very specific questions. I'll have some examples, and participants had to be very clear and specific about externalizing their predictions and why they were making those predictions, and assigning probabilities to their predictions. And so just really externalizing that judgment and decision-making process. And the point was to make that decision-making explicit and thus practice better habits through these forecasting tournaments that were actually low stakes versus a very high stakes, for example, intelligence environment. And Tetlock's finding in running these forecasting tournaments was that outstanding forecasters have certain characteristics that make them exceptional, and that other people can learn those characteristics and those techniques. So these techniques and characteristics include humility, the ability to decompose a problem, open-mindedness to alternative views, easier said than done, being probabilistic, and thoughtfully and frequently updating predictions. Tetlock kind of summarized this in having an ideal type hedgehog and fox, with this quote from a Greek poet: "The fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing." And Tetlock has this whole thing in the book where he kind of goes into the hedgehog as the pundit, and the fox is the more open-minded thinker that changes their mind. So the application is that anyone can participate in a forecasting tournament to improve their judgment and decision-making in a low-stakes setting. And I think I have, yes, on this slide, I have some examples. So the cool thing about forecasting tournaments is that Good Judgment Open, which Tetlock is involved with, the link is up there, actually runs these forecasting tournaments all the time. And so, for example, The Economist always sponsors questions every year. I think like Sky News is also sponsoring questions, like all these different organizations do. And it's really cool. Like you have questions like the ones listed here. And then I think this sample forecast that I pulled that's on the right-hand side of the screen is it must be the oil question. And so you can see how you really have to be quite probabilistic and not just, really saying, oh, it's like a 50-50 chance this will happen, but actually externalizing, like being very specific about externalizing the probability of different outcomes. And when Tetlock actually ran these forecasting tournaments, people had to write down their reasoning as well every time they made a forecast, whereas on the online site, a lot of people don't write their reasoning down, they just put their forecasts in. But this is a really interesting example of, okay, we have these cognitive biases and mental models and heuristics and shortcuts in thinking. What can we do to externalize some of those and actually try to address them in a lower stakes environment than our normal work? In addition to, and I won't talk about this for very long, but in addition to the stuff around cognitive biases and the way we think, there's also this issue in policymaking of how do we understand and describe complex systems, and how do we design products and policies and interventions that address that complexity. And so there's a whole realm of literature and systems theory that I don't really think I have time for, but I'll just leave this here. And if you're interested in it, you can look up this book. I'd highly recommend it and read some more about it. With my last minute, I'll just briefly summarize my PhD research because this is what I do full time now, even though I haven't spoken about it much. So as I said, I'm looking at central banks and how they're addressing climate change. And this work was really born out of my experiences at the Fed when it was quite early in addressing climate change and seeing not just the need to have better data or better modeling techniques, but a lot of the uncertainty that comes with, a brand new issue. How does this interact with our mandate? What is our role on this? What's appropriate? And so that's the kind of core of my research. But more specifically, I'm looking at classifying what the different types of policy responses are that have incorporated climate change at central banks, looking at why different central banks have selected those different approaches. And then that third question, which is what implications does addressing climate change in these ways have for central bank roles? And by roles, I mean the economic role of central banks and their societies, essentially. as I said, I've pivoted a bit from the behavioral economics, but it's still something that I think is really important and something that I hope to, again, be able to look at in my career in the future. So thank you very much. And yeah, happy to answer any questions.
All right. I don't see any at the moment, but everyone just feel free to put your questions into the chat and we can do a sort of a Q&A at the end. David, are you just about ready?
Can you hear me?
Yep, all good.
Can you see my slides?
Yes, but it's in the presenter view.
Hide presenter view?
Yep. So
Some,
just up top left, go from beginning.
Sorry?
The top, yep, just down a little bit from beginning.
That's what I did, but it seems to be wanting to
yep. Oh,
go there. Let me see if that will come over here. No, it won't. Dang. I think what I might need to do is find out where the share screen thing went.
You can take off use preventer view on the monitors tab just there. Maybe that'll work.
Is that working?
No. Try again.
See, it's showing on this other screen. I'm just trying to find where the screen sharing is. Hang on. Stop share. Let me do another share. Share screen. Here we go. This will work. Does that work? Yeah. Liam?
Yep, all good.
Can you see it now?
Yep.
Okay. Good, right. Well, okay. Thanks, everybody. From beginning, let me go back to that. It's not doing it. Everything works fine until you actually need it to work. So it's not going through on that. Hey. So is anything moving forward when I'm doing this?
No, we're stuck on that slide.
Stuck on that slide. Let me stop share. I'm going to have to make it share from the other screen. The screen. No, maybe this will work if I then. Now, will it let me go through it? No, it's not going to. Okay, well, I have to do the other share then. How annoying.
Right. Maybe while David's just working on that, we could have a couple of the questions from Monica, if you're there.
Yep, I am. Let me start my video. There we go. Yeah, so I saw, let's see. Yep, so in the Q&A, we have a question about policies related to climate change at central banks, which I can definitely talk about for a long time if you want me to, but I'll keep it brief. So I'll just say, like, there are broadly kind of two categories of policies that central banks have implemented. So one is really on the prudential side. So looking at kind of how supervised banks, for example, are addressing climate risk, and for example, the Bank of England and many other central banks, but have requirements for supervised banks to either each year kind of explain the ways that they're accounting for climate risk, or they might have requirements around disclosure. So that kind of thing. And then the other type of policy is the more promotional policy, where a central bank, for example, might have a preferential re-lending program so that interest rates on green loans are lower. The People's Bank of China, for example, has made use of that. And there are many other examples, but those are kind of the two types. And then I can just answer that. There was one other question in the chat I can address quickly. So other behavioral economics recommendations. So if you've already, I would say if you've already read Thinking Fast and Slow, Expert Political Judgment by Tetlock is also, or yeah, by Tetlock is another great option to get a perspective on behavioral economics. as well as, yeah, super forecasting by Tetlock as well, although that's not, I guess, so much specifically about behavioral economics, but it kind of is anyways, even if it's not marketed as such. And I will let, it looks like David has his screen going, so I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think it's only, I'm going to just have to show it the way it's showing here, yeah? Can you see the very first slide, fishing holidays?
Yep, no, that's all good.
Yeah, okay. I'm just going to have to go through it like this, click it through myself. Okay, well, thanks, everybody. So this is actually a little bit of a sideline kind of research area for me. I'm actually a decision theorist. So, but Liam asked about some work I've been doing on kind of really behavioral economics sort of applications of it. And one area I have been working on in the past, and also with a current collaborator more recently, is this idea of dark nudges. And Liam will remember, he also did his honours thesis on dark nudges, but that was to do with pricing and so on in supermarkets and department stores. But this is another application of that. It's really the other side, you could say the dark side of behavioural insights. So we're used to thinking about behavioural insights teams like BETA in Canberra, behavioural economics team of the Australian government, as using behavioural insights for the social good to try to help achieve various social goals, help people achieve what they say they want to do, but there's an actions to intentions gap and they're failing to do so. But the other side of this, which was called sludge by Richard Thaler, who's a recent Nobel laureate in behavioral economics. We prefer the name dark nudges to sludge. And he was saying that it's quite possible for marketers, casinos, dodgy pyramid scheme people, or all kinds of organizations to actually also draw upon the same kind of research that has taken place over the decades, the last few decades, and kind of use it for ill, you could say. And if that's the case, then we should be aware of this. There may be some role for some regulatory action there, but we should be aware of it so we can, at a minimum, be more alert and help to protect ourselves. And there was a book published by two other Nobel laureates, George Akerlof and Richard Thaler in 2015, called Fishing for Fools. And that kind of inspired the title of my first paper on this, which was called Fishing Holidays, the Market for Timeshares. That came out a few years ago. Okay, so basically this is about the economics of manipulation and deception. So can you see the second slide now?
Yep, all good.
Yep, okay. So basically we start off in the same way you would with normal behavioral economics and nudge units and so on, where you're trying to understand the importance of the choice context, the choice architecture, as they like to call it, which refers to how options are described, maybe how they're displayed, how deals and bargains are presented, how they might prime you by the use of particular stimuli in the supermarket, whether that's music or particular aromas and so on, or a more hard selling context, which is the one we're going to be looking at. And it turns out that contrary to standard economics, a lot of factors that should be effectively irrelevant turn out not really to be irrelevant at all. And so behavioral economics, as we saw from Monica, it starts to take account of various human frailties, you could say, or limitations due to opportunity cost of time and thinking and so on. And our tendency to get tired or emotionally involved in the decision making, or we feel we need to conform to someone else's expectations or society's norms and so on. And so it's possible then to start leveraging some of these factors in a way that is not necessarily in the consumer or society's interests. That's really what this is about. And Akerlof and Schiller make the important point, I guess, that if businesses have some understanding of these methods, which you'd expect through their sales departments and so on, then for them not to exploit consumer biases and weaknesses is like them choosing to leave big bills on the sidewalk. In other words, there's some easy money they are choosing not to take, which is kind of probably not necessarily true. Okay, so in other words, we should expect that unless there are suitable regulations or internal ethical constraints, you can expect that sometimes the choice architecture is going to try to work in the business's interest and not necessarily in the customer's interest, even though they will often try and present it as it is in your interests. Of course, that's what selling is all about. Okay, so this can happen, of course, without any conscious awareness on the part of the customers. A classic example there is the decoy effect. I won't go into what it is. That came out of the research in this field back in the early 80s, and now you see it used a fair bit in marketing. So here, of course, then nudging can go from being a powerful servant to improve social well-being and help people achieve their goals. It can then turn out to be a bit of a hidden master, making you into a bit of a sucker. Okay, so what is this thing called timeshares? It's also known as interval ownership. It started, of course, as particularly an American phenomena, but it has now spread to dozens of other countries, including Australia, although by far the biggest quantity of timeshare resorts and timeshare sales is in the United States. But we'll come back to some examples from Australia as well. So this is going back several years, but the average price of a timeshare, which is like, it used to be like buying a week, you're buying a week every year in some particular resort, and they're usually quite nice resorts in some location. And then you can kind of exchange these year by year if you want, or keep going back to the same resort. The last 15 years, they've moved to something even more abstract, which they call points. And you can cash in these points for different weeks at different times of year in different resorts. Okay, so the average purchase when people buy one of these, let's call it the week timeshare, is about 20,000 US. Given the total number of weeks that have been successfully sold in the United States, that means, this is a few years ago, but about 200 billion US dollars. So this is not small beer, okay? About 9 million US households have a timeshare, and about more than 1 in 7 people who have higher incomes. And that's partly because you have to have a bit of a higher income to be allowed to sit through the presentation. As we'll see a bit later on, ASIC did do a study recently in Australia, and just 5 companies, 5 of the largest, had about 178,000 owners, and they paid an average of 22,000 Australian dollars. And I'll come back to this point later, but about 250,000 Australian couples sit through these presentations every year, okay, and about 9% of them buy. Now, what's special about this? Why are we looking at this industry and not something else? Well, normally when you think about buying an investment product, you do your research, you look at the alternatives, and you might go out and buy it. You might even ask a financial advisor for advice. There's lots of things that you could do. If you want to buy accommodation, you might do a search on hotels. If you want to own something more, you might buy something outright. And of course, you do your research, and you'd be bidding in auctions or normal markets for housing and flats that we all know about. Now, the resort developers do not do this. Nobody is going out there looking to buy a timeshare, okay? So what they have to do is they have to pay people to be potential customers, okay? It's not completely unheard of. If you've ever been to certain nightclubs or even restaurants, they might have discounts earlier in the evening so that they can get a bit of an atmosphere going, have some bums on seats so that they look more attractive for when the discount is finished, to attract more people. So, but they have to take this to a whole new level. And the problem is, of course, every apartment in these huge resorts that they build has to be sold 52 times because you're selling a week each time. Okay, so who are the targets for this? Well, I've got the picture here of a big fish. The main targets, not exclusively, but the main targets are people vacationing, either through their existing timeshare owners, or they've seen through one of the websites the ability to rent an apartment at one of these resorts and so on. And still, those people are not going to volunteer to go to a timeshare sales presentation. So what do? Well, the bait, it's not a worm or a maggot. They give you something like 150 US dollars, sometimes a couple of free nights accommodation, that sort of thing. Very heavy discounts on activities. And of course, they market it as a no pressure sales pitch for about 60, 90 minutes. Sometimes they say 90 to 120. So in the United States, the average successful sale on this is about 10 to 12%. So you can just think about what the marketing costs are for each week of each unit out of hundreds or maybe thousands of units at a resort. If you're only getting maybe 1 in 9 people to come through, and you have to give all of them these bribes. So the marketing costs quite commonly can be half of the price that you're paying. So what kind of environment is it? Well, we have sat in on probably about at least a dozen, maybe 14 of these, mostly in the United States, but a couple in Australia as well. The thing to bear in mind is we think about markets in standard economics as you've got these sort of equal buyers and sellers, and they come together, they each bid, and you get market exchanges at an equilibrium price. Actually, a lot of markets aren't like that. And this is an extreme example of one that's not like that. So you have one side of the market, the seller, the supply side, designs the choice environment completely. It designs the choice architecture. And of course, it does not do so in a neutral way. Okay. I won't go through all of the details about how they do it, but basically, there's a lot of misdirection of attention. They know perfectly well that you're not really there to buy a timeshare. They pretend that they think you are, but they know perfectly well you're not. And I won't go into all of that, but it's quite clear. What they don't do in these is they don't mention all kinds of other things, like other sorts of investments you might make, other ways of buying a week at these resorts, for example, on the resale market. They don't talk about any of these other things. And if you do steer the conversation away, they're quite quick to push it back to the things they want to say. And you have no opportunity for research or for reflection, no time to go away and think about it, no second chances. And you have to decide there and then. And they use pretty heavy selling techniques. There's been a couple of the ones we went to weren't too bad, but most of them are pretty full on. And they leverage everything to try to get you to buy. And if you do buy, they do bring out some champagne, they open it up, all the other agents with their clients turn around and they all start clapping. So you're creating this social proof to show what a good deal this is, and you could be this happy person. Now, of course, in economics, we assume we have consumer sovereignty, but consumer sovereignty also assumes we have complete, clear, well-defined preferences over all goods and services. And that includes all kinds of ones you've never heard of. And many of you have probably never heard of buying points in timeshares. But nonetheless, standard economics assumes that we have already got this sort of preference ranking, and we act on this given our budget constraint to maximize our utility. If that were true, then all of this manipulation of choice architecture would not bring in enough extra money to be worth the effort. Okay. So how does this big industry exist where the buyer is paying to cover these exorbitant sales costs? What's going on here? Well, it's important to be aware that the buyers, of course, are attending for the bribes and not the product. The buyers are completely unprepared and ill-informed. They want to get in, get out as soon as they can. We, of course, do not always have complete, clear preferences. We have imprecise and hazy preferences. It's quite difficult to even get a sense of what a fair price would be for owning 1 week in perpetuity of one apartment at this resort. And since they've moved to selling points, which you exchange for weeks, what is 50,000 Wyndham points? What does that mean? What is a fair price for that? And the different developers all have different scales for dollar values of what their points are, just to make it even more impenetrable what it is you're trying to buy. They also draw very heavily on this book, Robert Cialdini, Influence, the Psychology of Persuasion. There's 6 principles he uses there, and they use all of them, believe me. Now, when I first wrote a paper on this, there was hardly anything written that actually looked at timeshares from this kind of perspective at all. It was purely, there's very few things on it anyway, in all the literature I could find in any discipline. And most of it was just not relevant at all to the questions I was interested in. And so I wrote a paper on it, and then someone who was involved in legal cases in America contacted me after that and wanted to further develop this, and we've been collaborating more recently. But basically what we're looking at here, and anytime you're looking at dark nudges, is there's big money being made, and the people making it are doing something that is really rather dodgy, and they do not want it exposed. They do not want their business model undermined. So good luck trying to collaborate with these companies if you're going to be doing or publishing anything that might be against their interests. So we call this difficult access research, and you have to sort of triangulate in lots of different ways to get at some answers. Now, when I wrote my paper, it was before, a few years ago, it was before ASIC, the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, started responding to an inordinate number of complaints about timeshares. And they wrote a really good report on this. They published it in December 2019. It's got lots of redacted parts as well. But this is a really nice little summary of some of the key points there about the different stages of the consumer journey, how it works, and the risks and harms in all of this. And not only that, they also commissioned a confidential financial analysis, which only recently, when I set up a meeting with the people at ASIC, did I find out that, in fact, there is access to this through the Parliamentary Library webpage, which hardly anybody knows about, because they had to release it in response to parliamentary questions. So it's fascinating, but it's the only kind of real analysis by any regulatory agency in any country that I'm aware of, certainly not the United States. So they looked at 5 of the largest companies here, which had about 178,000 owners at that time. There's some basic stats about it. About at least 40% and often 90%, depending on the company, of people buying the timeshare also borrow from them at interest rates of about 13–14% a year. And half of the buyers borrowing using finance borrow almost all of it. So in other words, they really couldn't be affording this product in the first place. And the assumptions they make about the implicit rate of return and the payback periods required are assuming things like you get to use the product you've bought every single year and you use it intelligently and so on. When it looks at the points products, they found not one of the products available. And by the way, when you go to a timeshare thing, they explain the different options to you, but you're not allowed to take a picture. You're not allowed to take any of those details away with you. You have to be deciding and signing off legally there and then. And the only reason ASIC could do this is because they have compulsory powers, okay? Only a government regulatory agency has those powers. So none of us as researchers could get the information that they revealed, which is hidden on the Australian Parliament webpage. So you're getting rates of return between 0% over 10 years and -9% if you get a low resale value, and -4% a year if it's a high resale value. This assumes you're using the points all the time and you didn't do any borrowing at all. Okay, so just to give a little example here, if I take this one, this Wyndham purchase, 22,000 after 10 years, if you sold it for 20% resale, and that's a low, but the high is 40, okay? So you could buy the same damn thing. If you go on to timeshare resales, you can get effectively the same thing for 70% cheaper price than what they're trying to make you pay. It turns out they say the rate of return per year for 10 years is -7.3%. So I just said, okay, 10 years, rate of return -7.3% a year on 22,000. This is 0.927, that's 1 minus 0.073 to the power of 10 years. That gives you 0.4686. Multiplied by that, it gives you a value of 10,300. So a loss of, they said a loss of 10,400. That's because of rounding here and rounding in mine, okay? But as Liam would remember from his honours, people like to say, oh, it's another day I never needed to use algebra from school. Well, actually, there were many occasions probably in interpreting different compound discounts and all kinds of other deals or understanding financial investments when you certainly did need to know your algebra, but you didn't, and you didn't remember that you needed it. So even if you knew it, you didn't remember to apply it. So that's another big drawback. So the resale market, that's essentially, the timeshare resorts try hard to make the difference between a resale week and their own bigger, but for the first approximation, you're buying essentially the same thing on the resale market. And the difference is you're not paying for all of those selling costs. And you can probably get it for 25, 30% of the price the resort would have you pay. So instead of paying 22,000, you could probably pick that up for 5,000, 6,000. So you would have just lost $16,000 if you sign, and about 10% of people sign. So what are the overall losses, just to sort of wrap this up? This is using all of the principles of behavioral insights to shape the choice architecture against the interests of the consumer. So if you've got roughly $200 billion spent on timeshare intervals, and it's probably more, it would be more than that now, 220, 230, roughly 140 billion of that is welfare loss. Okay, so some words of advice. One last question. Would you now buy a timeshare at a developer presentation? You can see I've got the guy here, he's got his little devil horns on. And if not, what regulatory protections would you like to see? If you do buy, here are a few pointers. Do not buy if you need to use finance from a developer. You're never ever going to get anything close to value for money. It's just not possible. Do not buy if you anticipate difficulties using the points intervals in full wherever you wish to be having your holidays every year. Be selective which developer you buy from, which is very difficult because you don't know which are the good ones unless you read the ASIC report, and that's only for Australia. Make your reservations at the earliest opportunity each year. The way in which you cash in your weeks across resorts or across time periods or your points, compared with renting an apartment at those same resorts at those same times, varies tremendously. So if you're not smart in how you use what you've got, again, you're going to really be losing out. And even better, go along, get the free stuff from the developer, resist. And if you do like the resorts, and believe me, many of them are great places to stay, go to a reseller, look up timeshare resales, or go to the user group Tug2Net before you commit. And that's it. Happy holidays.
Wow, that was fantastic, David. I never even realized how big that industry was.
Yeah.
I've heard a little bit about it, but I didn't realize just how big, even in Australia. I'm surprised in Australia that contracts that don't have like cooling off periods are even legal.
They do have cooling off periods. It's about 2 weeks. And ASIC talks about this too, and a lot of people who, who they compulsorily required to get interviews, but required the timeshare company to put them onto some buyers. The problem with the cooling off periods, often they're 7 days, maybe 14 days, and people are often still on holiday. And sometimes you have to wait for stuff to arrive in the mail, and sometimes it's deliberately not sent in time, and they're told, oh, you'll have this opportunity later, and things conspire, or you have to go through the particular person you had the presentation with, and of course they're very keen not to answer your calls. So there's a lot of things that can go wrong even with cooling off periods.
Wow, that is incredible. It strikes me that like this just sounds illegal, and like the way you described it and the research you've done behind it, it just sounds like a classic manipulative marketing, almost down sort of the pyramid scheme territory.
Yeah, it's close, actually. It's the one difference is that there really is a product. With the pyramid scheme, there actually isn't anything. But with the timeshare product, actually, some of these places are great to stay at. We bought one in Maui, and we got it, of course, from the resale market at a brilliant price, actually, and we love it. But if you don't know what you're doing and you don't know how to buy it, then some of the testimony from the ASIC had in their interviews, they hired companies to do the interviews for them. I mean, a lot of people, they're a lot poorer than me, and they're maybe much older, and they're not even going to get the opportunity to do this. And the holding costs each year because you have to pay these maintenance fees. People are just freaking out and they just can't believe that they've thrown $10,000, $15,000 down the tube, basically, by this kind of being paid to be, you know, we're paying for the right to try and sell on you as hard as possible and make it as awkward for you as possible to get out of this room without having bought. We're experts at it now, by the way. We've been to many, but yeah.
So one more from me. Do you feel that ASIC's going to go down the road of trying to regulate sort of dark nudging?
I don't know. I don't know. The ASIC did tighten some of the regulations as a result of these reports here. I don't think they're going to go any further in the near future. They're very interested to see the paper I've been writing with John Krotz. And I sent them a couple of other things they might have been interested in. So certainly we've sort of established a bit of a dialogue now. But I mean, if you look at where the problem is by far at its worst, it's the US. And you've got no chance at all of Congress coming in regulating this. My co-author, who was in South Carolina, he's now moved to Hawaii, University of Hawaii. He says, you know, like take Florida, the laws and regulations around this in Florida are written by the timeshare lobbies. So how you know, who they give the money to and everything else. And so basically you're kind of stuffed unless you through the education we might be trying to do, you're stuffed. Whereas ASIC is quite different. In Australia, it's different. They're going to come out and defend the customers. But it's not been bought by the lobbies. So, were there any questions, Liam? I can't seem to see anything.
Nothing in the Q&A at the moment. Everyone online, feel free to put some questions in. I suppose, Monica, I got one for you, just while we're on questions. Do you, like, in this high inflationary environment that we are in and so is the rest of the world, do you feel there's going to be a trade-off between climate change and trying to get economies back to stability, as far as from a Reserve Bank perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think that question, it's an excellent question. It doesn't have a simple answer necessarily. I think the important bit, though, to highlight in answering that question is the role of governments, not just central banks, in addressing climate change, because as we've seen with energy prices right now, clearly when there are disruptions to energy sources, that contributes to price increases in energy, for example. And I don't think that's the only reason we're having broad spectrum inflation right now, but obviously that contributes to price levels. And central banks can really only do so much in addressing those particular issues. They really are actors that serve whole of economy interests, and we really need fiscal authorities and governments to manage the kind of energy transition and manage and kind of smooth any bumps that there may be, which may contribute to inflation. And I guess I especially say this coming from an American perspective, because Congress in the US has had a lot of issues with passing legislation due to various political dynamics and gridlock. And so I think there is this risk that too much gets put on the central bank, which really in a lot of countries can't do the types of industry specific policy that are needed to manage those economic outcomes. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, thank you. There seems to be no further questions in the Q&A. So we might just wrap up. Thank you so much, Monica and David, for your presentations today. Both fantastic and really interesting. Looking forward to your paper, David. Sort of the continuation of that one. And Monica, when you're done your PhD, I'd love to read it as well. So thank you all for coming, and have a pleasant evening.
Great, thank you.
So much.
Bye.